Welcome back. This is the Weekend Report. I'm Masachaba Mposwa. The SAPS says it has destroyed drugs with a street value of more than 5.2 billion rand in the past 3 years. National Police Commissioner General Fannie Masemola oversaw the destruction of 800 kilograms of narcotics, including mandrax and cocaine, in Cape Town yesterday. Masemola says a number of operations yielded good results in removing drugs off the street. In the past 6 months, more than 20 drug traffickers were arrested at OR Tambo International Airport. Now, are we a drug-infested country? Let's speak to Peter Ucko, CEO at TAG, Tobacco, Alcohol and Gambling Advisory Advocacy and Action Group. Good morning, Peter. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
Firstly, what is the single most significant obstacle hindering the effective combating of drug trafficking in South Africa?
I suppose the answer has to be the kingpins, the leaders of the cartels which are trafficking drugs. Because remember, we've now caught a lot of drugs that were destined for South Africa, but we've also become a gateway for distribution of drugs to other parts of the world. The cartel leaders know that a certain amount of their drugs are going to be corked and confiscated, but they know that a certain amount will get through. So we don't know of the 5.2 billion rands worth of drugs of the last 2 years that have been dealt with in South Africa. We don't know how much actually got through and into the hands of drug peddlers and therefore drug users in South Africa. And we don't know how many of that is killing our youth, particularly our youth, because their unemployment levels are high and the youth are bored. And so they take to the artificial stimulants like drugs. But we're also a gateway to drug trafficking throughout the rest of the world.
And we'll expand on that. But what specific support does the Central Drug Authority provide to the police in their efforts to curb drug trafficking and abuse?
Well, I can't answer that accurately because I haven't seen the latest drug master plan. And I no longer serve on the directorate of the CDA. But generally, the Central Drug Authority will give some sort of advice or leadership or guidance towards how to combat and what to look for in drug smuggling. But we've got no solid, or the CDA has no solid action in getting to identify the drug traffickers and the drug trafficking. We have to rely on the other departments within the government, and that is people like, of course, Port Health, the customs and excise people at the various points of entry. And in this case, it would mostly be OR Tambo International Airport, because that's where flights go in and out and in and out. And vigilance is the thing. Vigilance and the ultimate, I think you said, Masachaba, that 20 people have been arrested. That's the tip of the massive iceberg. It's the tiny tip of a massive iceberg. We need to get to the leaders, and we don't know who they are. They could be people who are highly placed in all sorts of governments all over the world. They could be people who are highly placed in the law enforcement authorities, and therefore they protect themselves and they hide themselves well. But that's who we need to get to ultimately to protect our people and our youth in South Africa.
The fact that we don't know who they are is quite a scary thought. But can you share your thoughts on the recent destruction of 5.2 billion rands worth of drugs by the police over the past 3 years?
Yeah, well, that's good news. It means that that's 5.2 billion rands worth of drugs that haven't got onto the streets of South Africa. The streets of every part of South Africa, that is the densely populated cities, the smaller towns, and the rural areas. Because those drugs will get into all parts of South Africa and kill many, many hundreds of thousands of South Africans just because they got into the streets. So I couldn't even guess a number of how many lives we've saved. The frightening thing is we don't know the number of the drugs that have got through the system and eventually ended up on the streets.
What are some of the underlying social and economic factors that contribute to drug abuse in South Africa?
Well, unemployment is a big one, and boredom of the youth is a biggie. You need to, if you lead an exciting life And exciting has various levels. For some people, just sitting down and reading a book is exciting because you don't know what adventures are going to come through on the pages of a book. But we need extracurricular activities in schools, and we need entertainment for the youth. And entertainment doesn't mean having movies shown on screens in townships. Entertainment means learning to play a sport, whether that's football or rugby or tennis or hockey. It doesn't matter what it is. Playing sports really energizes people and releases dopamines in your brain, which means you don't need the drugs, because that's all drugs are going to do, release dopamine and other feel-good chemicals. And we need education. And we can start teaching youngsters now who are bored and sitting on the sides of streets and not knowing what to do with themselves, and they're targets for drug peddlers. We could be teaching them to sew and to knit and to repair motor cars and to simple things like changing a tire on a motor car when they have a puncture. There's millions of things that we can do to keep them entertained, to keep their minds stimulated, and that'll keep them away from drugs.
I hear you. Are there any programs that have shown the greatest success in addressing drug-related problems, including addiction, crime, and health issues?
I don't think we can name any particular program. We know within communities, there are small groups who are doing wonderful work in doing the sorts of things that I just mentioned, keeping young people particularly entertained, teaching them how to do mechanical things. You can start when you're 10, 12, 14 years old, during your spare time after school, learning how to be a plumber or anything. And that doesn't mean you'll become a plumber when you're an adult, but it means you have self-sufficiency in doing things around the house as a plumber would be. And so there are little groups that are doing amazing work like that. There are granny groups that are doing knitting and sewing, and you can get youngsters into those groups. Now they're going to learn not only to sew and to knit and do all sorts of mechanical things and mechanical things would usually tend more to the male child, whereas sewing and knitting to a female child. Not always the truth, because some of the greatest designers, the couturiers of this world, are men. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of crossover that can be done, but they're done in small little groups, in small little villages, by people who are dedicated to keeping our youngsters safe. Mm-hmm. We need to expand that.
You mentioned quite a lot of very alarming facts around drugs in South Africa. Now, is South Africa's fight against international drug trafficking and organized crime hampered perhaps by a lack of intelligence sharing and collaboration with other nations?
I think that there is. We tend not to collaborate with everybody that we can. For example, if you look at the situation right now, and I don't want to get into the realm of politics, but South Africa is having a bit of an argument with the United States about all sorts of things like the AGOA agreements and all things like that. And South Africa's taken a certain stance in the political world, the International Criminal Court and so on. So you're going to have a lot of supporters of what South Africa is doing on the one hand, who might be sharing intelligence, but you've got a lot of people on the other side, and that includes large parts of Europe and particularly the United States, who have lots of intelligence to share with us. But because South Africa has taken a certain angle on political issues, we lose out on the intelligence side of having strong allies.
You also mentioned OR Tambo as the popular port of entry for drugs. How would you rate the current state of security at South African airports, particularly OR Tambo, in terms of preventing drug trafficking?
Oh, I have no idea how I would evaluate that. The thing is that we know, I certainly know, that there are many dedicated officials in the import-export divisions at OR Tambo, in the South African police services, in Port Health. There are many dedicated individuals who would give their lives to protecting South Africa and South Africans' children. But what we also do know that in every level of government and in every sphere of business as well, particularly, you'll find that there are some people who would be a little bit soft and who are able to be bribed. And so I couldn't put a measure on it. So we need to root out the people who are giving away internal information at the ports of entry. And I mentioned, or you mentioned, OR Tambo, because that's the hub for flights in and out of South Africa. And I think that if you look at Cape Town International, it'll be just to a smaller extent. But aircraft coming from South America, from Sao Paulo, Brazil, from all over South America, through South Africa, you can be sure that on virtually every single flight, there's at least one drug mule. I've been on some of those flights, and I'm not an expert in body language and behavior, but I sit in the departure lounges and I look at the people around me and I think, how come they are traveling from South America back to South Africa? And they just arrived 2 days ago and now they're going back to South Africa. You wonder, you can see that they're drug mules.
Yeah.
The thing is, the hotels know that there are on every flight 3 or 4 drug mules. So 1 or 2 of them will get caught, but a lot gets through. So to evaluate why South Africa is so bad, partly it's our lack of cooperation with intelligence, but partly it's also the fact that many of our officials are, it's been shown in the past, bribable or subject to coercion. But I repeat what I said at the beginning. There are dozens of dedicated officials in various departments who are doing a sterling job and who are dedicated to rooting out the drug problem in South Africa.
Now, speaking of bribes and being basically weaknesses to coercions and such, how significant is corruption among law enforcement officials in facilitating drug trafficking, and what measures can be taken to address this issue?
Well, those are internal security measures that the government and the units within government have to address. And it came to my mind the other day, I think the movie is called Serpico, where you get very good undercover police officers infiltrating into cartels and getting intelligence that way. But those are the internal workings of various departments. Unfortunately, in South Africa, I think that it's too low. And you mentioned also the bribery and corruption that can take place. That's a lot that we got to root out. But it goes back to what I said right in the beginning. The key is to find the kingpin, the leadership of those cartels, and destroy the organizational structure. Unfortunately, the really bad guys, who are the intelligence brains behind these big criminal gangs and big criminal business operations, they hide themselves well. Those are the ones we have to catch. And to catch them requires massive input from our secret service type operations in the country.
And lastly, but very briefly, what role can education and awareness campaigns play in preventing drug abuse among young people particularly, and how can they be made more effective?
Well, they can play a huge role. Getting young people educated as to what are drugs and how drugs can be harmful, because it's very nice for young people to just try this. And then they try it and they feel great. You know, the feeling from some of the drugs is amazing. You feel wonderful. But that's not all of the education. It's the results. And education doesn't mean getting somebody who's quite boring talking to young people about the harms of drugs. That's kind of boring. Okay, so drugs can cause harm. We all know that. But at some stage, some of the youth are going to try it. And we don't know who's going to become very heavily addicted. And the drugs today are designed to be hugely addictive and very speedily addictive.
All right.
But education, just telling people the bad points about drug addiction and drug abuse, that's kind of boring. We need to make that education exciting and adventurous and encourage the youth not to take drugs, but to encourage their friends also to never start. And it's an expression we've used very often, whether it comes to drugs or smoking cigarettes or anything. I am too smart to start.